Hello, Happy Valley. Today's video is all about the element of art known as value. Now, value deals with the lightness or darkness of a color, and value is key to the illusion of light. We need light in order to see an object and understand it. Value is incredibly important, especially in the world of art, because it helps artists communicate to their viewers what it is exactly that they are looking at. With value, we'll be working with pen and ink, along with graphite pencils, and even we're going to transition into India ink with the dip pen and ink wash. Anyway, let's get started. So let's talk about graphite pencils before we move on into the element of art for value. But I went over this in the video for exploring graphite, but I'm going to do this with our notes. So an H pencil, an H drawing pencil, the H stands for hardness. And H leads, they are extremely smudge resistant. They're best for clear lines, for preliminary lines, for getting your sketches onto your composition. They are really good for small minor details. The lead is much harder, so it makes a much lighter mark. Then you have your middle grade pencils. If you see an F pencil, those are usually on your higher quality drawing pencils. Most of the time you'll see an HB. And if you look on a regular number 2 pencil, a regular pencil that you would use in the classroom, not a mechanical pencil, but a regular one, you'll see mostly, or most of the time, it will say an HB or an American number 2. And that's just a standard lead. They're great for, right in the middle, really. They're great for writing, though, and that's why we use them for in the classroom. Also, they're great for whenever you're taking the test where you have to fill in the bubbles. That is the grade in which the computer or the processor is able to identify that lead. Then you have B pencils, and this stands for boldness or blackness. And a B lead is very smooth. It's a softer lead, and it's. I love B pencils. They feel great. Um, they're best for shading. They smudge real easily, and they're just a soft lead. I love writing with them, but if you're trying to get into a tiny area, that pencil needs to be extremely sharp because it's going to make a broader mark. All right, so let's really get into the meat or in depth with this element of art. So value, and value is simply how light or dark a color is. Every color has a value, and it's kind of hard when we're looking at colored pictures to really distinguish this and to see those individual values. So let's change it up a little bit. This brings it down to a desaturated level where we are able to see the darker areas of the photographs, the lighter areas of the photographs, and we're able to take the color aspect out of it and put everything on a grayscale. And this lets us see that each color, each shade has its own unique value. Now, value clearly depends on light. Duh. We need light in order for it to help us understand what it is that we're looking at. If we were in blackness and we couldn't see a dang thing, then we wouldn't be able to understand or interpret what it is that we're looking at. So value is clearly dependent on light. And it's the amount of light that's hitting a surface, that's reflecting off of that surface, that allows us to interpret and understand what it is. Now, this is something added that I like to add in here: and newborn babies and values. So, as newborns, we can only focus about 8 to 12 inches from our face. If you take a regular ruler and place it on your forehead, that's about the distance a newborn, an infant, is able to see. So anything outside of that area becomes very blurry. Now, also, when they're first born, they see black and white and grays. Okay, The reason why is because each of their eyes has the physical structure. It looks like two eyes, but they haven't learned to work together yet. And also, um, things in the eyes haven't fully developed. Okay. We don't come out of the womb as an adult. We have to develop over the years. Okay, same thing with the structures of our body parts and things like that. Our eyes, they need to develop. So those things haven't quite happened yet. So we see black and white when we're first born, and we can only see about 12 inches from our face. So the first few weeks and months of a baby's life, they're learning how to use those eyes together. Their eyes are actually learning how to see. So now, as they get older, their color vision begins to develop. So, one of the first colors that babies will see is red. And then eventually, as they, over 5 months, over 6 months of age, they will be able to see the full spectrum of colors that we see, Roy G. Biv. So, this is by Weimer and Ferguson up here on the screen. And Weimer and Ferguson realizes and understands the development of infants and understands the development of the eyes. And so they have developed these toys that are primarily in high contrast. There's black, there's white. There are no middle contrasts in there. Okay. And then they've added in that pop of color. And what color did they choose? Red. Why did they choose red? Because that's the first color that babies will begin to see. Kind of interesting. So, value is something that we talked about in space a little bit when we were talking about those optical perspective techniques. If you remember, they were size relationships, placement of objects, those five things. So one of them was value. And so I said in that unit or last unit that we were talking about that value, the lighter that the value becomes, the further back we are going. Like when we were talking about the mountain ranges, remember mountains that are closer to the viewer are going to become darker. As they get away from the viewer, they recede, they become lighter in value. So value is really important in art because it helps us as artists create this illusion of depth with highlights, with cast shadows, and it kind of adds this third dimension to our, two-dimensional designs or two-dimensional drawings. So one of the ways that we understand or work with value is with a value scale. And this is a tool that artists use. And what a value scale is it's just a series of spaces. So it's little sections of shades of a color. Every color has value. Every color has a value scale. When we work with value in this unit, we're going to stick with the black and the white. We leave color for the unit on color. But you can see here that these are individually spaced different values, and they're ranging from darkest to lightest, and it can go opposite lightest to darkest. It doesn't really matter, but they are individually spaced. You can see a clear definition between each value. Now, on the other hand, we have a gradient. And this is something where it's a nice, smooth transition from the lightest value to the darkest value. So you cannot really clearly define, if you look at this, where those colors or where those values change. It's all one thing. Another tool that we use in art is called a chiaroscuro. The chiaroscuro, not chiaroscuro, Claire. And I know there's no L in there, but it is a Italian word. And chiaroscuro, it is a method for applying values to something that would be flat when we want to make it look three-dimensional. So we use the sphere as our representative, okay? A sphere, we could draw a circle on a piece of paper and it's just simply a circle. But once we start to add values to it and we move in a curvilinear shape, it now begins to look like something round, but it's on a flat surface. So this chiaroscuro method, this is something that was introduced during the Renaissance. This little tool was introduced during the Renaissance, and it's something that we still use today. And what it says is that there's a set of rules, a system that you need to follow. And it says that if light is coming in from one direction, then the light and the shadows will conform to that set of rules and follow this guideline. So it has 5 steps, starting with highlight, moving on to light, shadow, reflected light, and cast shadow. So those 5 steps. The highlight is going to be the lightest area. So if you look at the sphere on the screen, this little part right in here, that is our lightest value. That is where our light source is directly hitting. That light beam is going right towards that object. Now, as that surface begins to curve, we're going to start losing light. The light is not going to be as direct, right? And so we're getting just fragments of that light is hitting this object. And so it's going to become a little bit darker, slightly. Then we start to get towards the meat of that circle, or towards the middle part of the sphere. So at this point, we're not getting any direct light from our light source. Instead, we're just getting indirect light. Light is bouncing off other areas, other objects, other things, and it's going back towards this object. So again, our shadow is going to become even more dark. Then if you look down here, if you can kind of see this little crescent shape here, this is the reflected light. Okay, so what's happening is this object is, and reflected light necessarily doesn't happen in nature. It might happen, but this is more of a concept that's done through artistry, through drawing, through whatever, painting, anything. And what this is the reflected light is more for the artist to help its viewer or their viewers understand what it is that they're looking at. So this is a sphere, and we want to make it look like a sphere. We want it to be rounded. So what we've done as an artist is add this reflected light. And what we're saying is light is bouncing off of the surface, and it's letting us understand what exactly it is we're seeing. So it's just a tiny little hairline of this white light, or this light shape, that's helping us interpret that this is a curvilinear shape. This is a sphere. And then the last thing that we have is the cast shadow, and that's down here at the bottom. Now, this is going to be your darkest value. This is the shadow being created from the object. Now, it's going to, this is, computer generated, so it's not the best example, but if you, in real life or whenever you were drawing, what would happen is this shadow would be quite intense, closest to that object. And as it gets further away from the object, it's going to become lighter in value. So just slightly, okay? It's going to just lose a little bit of that. One, because we're getting away from the object and we're getting more indirect light, and is really the primary reason for why that does that. Now, when we're working with value, we use different materials. So let's say we're trying to create values with pins. You can't use the same concepts that you use with a graphite pencil as you do with a pin. A pin is more permanent. You don't have the ability to erase a pin unless you have those fancy pins that erase. But graphite pencil, you have a little bit of flexibility in there to erase things. So you have to use different techniques when you're working with pins. There are 4 pen and ink techniques. The first one is known as hatching. And I talked about this when we did the working with markers, practicing with markers. I mentioned hatching, cross hatching, and those are those pen and ink techniques. They are not just for pen and ink. Okay, they can be used with anything that is a permanent surface. Well, to be honest with you, you can even use them with graphite pencils. But these are primarily theories or ideas that you would use with something that's more permanent based. to allow you to create value. So hatching is just lines created drawing in the same direction, all facing in the same direction. Now, the closer that these lines become to each other, the darker the value is going to be. So the more white space or the more, whatever your background color is, the more of that you leave, the lighter that the value is going to appear. So just look at these little boxes down here at the bottom of your screen. The heavier place that these lines are, the darker the value. The more white space or the red that we see down here, the lighter the value is going to become. Same thing up here. The darker, the more marks that you have, and they're all going in the same direction. They don't have to go in a specific direction. If they're going horizontally, then they all need to go horizontally. If they're going at an angle, then they all need to go at that same angle. If they have a little bit of a curve to them, like the one in the yellow or the green, then they need to all have that curve to them. So the heavier placed, the more of that mark that you have near each other, the darker the value. The more space in between those marks that you have, the lighter the value is going to become. Cross hatching is really the sister of hatching. So cross hatching is simply crossing lines in two different directions, at least two different directions. Now, if you're really trying to make a darker value, you could put these in 4, 5, 6, 7 different directions. You could have horizontal, vertical, diagonal, and two different diagonals. You can overlap and layer these things. Now, one thing with cross hatching is that not all the lines have to cross each other. You don't have to make an X, okay? And, what best to see that then here is in the examples on the left-hand side of the screen. If you look at the yellow one, we have all of these, you can see here, they start out with hatching down here, then cross hatching, we have it in two different directions, and then up here in this area, we have multiple directions, 3, 4, 5 different directions things are going. Okay, so the more directions or the more lines you have, the darker the value. But not every single line has to cross. So you can see that parts of this are just crossing, this line is much longer, other parts are crossing with it. But the way for this to really have a great outcome is to not be so uniform, not to be such a machine. You don't want to create a grid. You just want to simply make these marks. They're quick little lines. You don't want to sit there and try and make perfect lines because you're starting to draw a grid. You're not doing cross hatching. Scumbling. This is I love this one. It's super fun. It's super fast to do. And it's just a bunch of little tiny squiggly circular lines all made in different directions. The more controlled you are, and when I say controlled, that means working in one specific little area over and over and over again. So the more control, the heavier your mark will become. The looser you are, the more movement you have, the larger space that you work in, skipping around, the lighter the value is going to become. Now, this is one of those pen and ink techniques that you really only use when you really need a lot of texture. And you can kind of see that when you look at the sphere over here on the top left-hand side. There's quite a lot of texture being created with this mark. You use this when you're working with furs or hair of any type, beards. It's great for beards. There are purposes for scumbling, but it's one of those that you don't generally see unless it's like a surface that you're trying to create a fuzzy, hairy texture to it. And so if you look over here on the right-hand side, this is very controlled over here in the right-hand corner. Lots of control. As we get away from that down in this area, we have less control. It's a little bit more wild. It's all over the place. Okay? And it creates a lighter value. Heavier marks, more control that you're working in, the darker that value is going to appear. And our fourth and final pen and ink technique would be stippling. Stippling is just so much fun. I really enjoy this technique, but I will tell you that it is so time consuming. You're placing little tiny dots on your paper. the more dots you have, the darker the value is going to appear. The more spread out those dots are, the more of your background that you have, the lighter that they're going to appear. Um, Now, sometimes when we work with this technique, we start to get tired and we start to what I like to call jackhammer. So we start hearing this because our hand is getting so tired, and then we're rushing, and we end up making more of a hatch mark than a stippled mark. So this is one of those techniques that if you're going to employ it and use it, sometimes you got to work on it for a few minutes and then put the pen down, walk away, go do something else, come back, add a little bit of more stippling to it, because it can easily wear you out, and then you can easily start jackhammering and sound ridiculous when you're working with this technique. The harder you press down and the more of that sound you make, it doesn't mean that the ink is going to come out any faster. Okay, so what happens, and you'll see this whenever you work on assignments when we do these techniques, is that you'll start to see a lot of hatching going on because you're rushing. Now, I love these pen and ink marks. I think pen and ink is such a cool medium to work with. So I'm going to show you some art by an artist named Ben Alvis. He creates some really cool pen and ink art pieces. So you can clearly see in here, we have some stippling, we have some hatching, we have some cross hatching. Other things that you can do with pen and ink would be contour lines. Remember that from line? Thick lines, thin lines. It doesn't necessarily have to be only these 4 techniques that you employ. It's just that hatching, cross hatching, scumbling, stippling, those are generally associated with pen and ink marks. You don't have to fill the whole space in too. Here we have a little bit of cross hatching up here in Garfield's, shirt here. And then we have white space being left in between. We moved into hatching because they're all going in one direction. And you'll notice hatching and cross hatching, these are your more dominating of the 4 pen and ink marks. Hatching and cross hatching doesn't mean you need to fill the entire space. If you look at the skull, he's left a lot of white space in between. He's primarily shading around the outer edges, around those surfaces, and he's leaving a lot of white space. And that's what gives us different values. So you don't have to color in that whole section or that whole shape. You can leave a lot of white space. Here's a great example of scumbling. If you look at the guy on the right-hand side with the gun that says bang, look at his shirt, look at his hat. You can really see a lot of scumbling in there. We just have lines going in all sorts of directions, tiny squiggly all over the place, erratic lines, and it creates these awesome textures. But down here in his shirt, really in the brim of his hat, because he's wanting to create something super textured. You have hatching around the eyes here. They're curved, but they're still hatching. Those lines are going in certain directions. And it helps provide value. You can see a little bit of cross hatching in the fingers. Tons of cross hatching down here in the brim of the edge of the table. Over here too. A lot of that. And then you have a lot of thick, thin, dark lines. So again, those 4 pen and ink marks, those are not the only things that you can use when you're working with this stuff. I just love this. I think this is hilarious to me. I have a cat. He scratches everything. Here we have some more scumbling because he's really trying to create a dark texture on it. And I love that they're going to spray him with water. Love, 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 love. All right. So that is just a basic introduction to the element of art known as value.